Thank you. So, related to the topic that I am about to talk about, there are two things that I'm not. I'm not a designer, and I'm also not a user of assistive technologies. I'm a developer, like I suspect that most of you are, but I have been doing a lot of work that is related to accessibility in the Skype for iOS app. And just because I'm a developer doesn't mean that this is a very technical talk. I am going to talk about accessibility, of course, but this talk is mostly about thinking about accessibility. And I hope that you will find that equally relevant whether you're a designer or a developer. Just a quick question. Are there any designers in the audience? A few? 1, 2, 3. Good. So starting with that word, accessibility, just from the components of it, we can tell that it is the ability to access or use what in our case is the application or service that we provide. But if you also look it up in a dictionary, you will see it being defined as the ability to be easily used and also the ability to be easily understood. It speaks of good things, but in itself it stays very, it mostly talks about the functionality. So a similar term that I really like is to be inclusive, because to me it feels like it implies an equality among all the users. And it doesn't only speak about the functionality, it also opens up to enjoyment. So the apps that I do want to talk about, they're easy to use, they're easy to understand, but they're preferably also enjoyable to all users. And accessibility in software, it relates to many things, and this is mostly talking about iOS, but because Apple does such a great job with iOS, and Google does a good job with Android as well, the area that we as app developers interact with most directly is visual impairment. Since the introduction of the iPhone 3GS, which was 2009, iOS has had a screen reader called VoiceOver that existed on the Mac before that. And it opens up the whole system to blind or low vision users, and it does so through gestures and spoken descriptions. And I'm going to get back to VoiceOver in more detail, but for the moment I want to stay on the topic of presentation through spoken descriptions. Because there's something nice about having to use only words, and we can use those textual descriptions to help us think about our applications and their elements, but also about their content and functionality. And we do so by asking very, very simple questions like, what is it and what does it do? So let's look at some examples. This is the built-in music app on iOS, and there's a decent amount of things on the screen. Starting with the playback controls. We have these 3 buttons that they take you to the previous track, the next track, and in the middle you have the button that pauses playback. So let's just ask ourselves, what is it? Well, it's the pause button. And you would probably also say that it's the next track button and the previous track button. So what does it do? Well, in this case, the main description that we just had, the answer to what is it, it is so obvious from it that we don't really need to describe it any further. The only thing we need to do is that we need to make sure that what it actually does matches what the name of it implies. Just below it, we have volume control. And in this screenshot, you see that the volume is at roughly 50%. So asking again, what is it? Well, it's the volume control, right? At 50%. We also have some information about the track that is currently playing. We see that we have the name of the track, but also the name of the artist and the name of the album. And we also have the album art. It takes up quite a big amount of screen space, so we shouldn't forget about that one. In the top right, we have the first element where we need to stop, because at first it's not obvious what it is. But it's a button, so we can always ask ourselves, what does it do? And if you've ever used this app, you will know that tapping that button displays a list of all the tracks for that album. So going back to what is it, and aiming to be as concise as possible, we could describe it as the track list button, because it's more concise than the list of tracks button, and it's certainly more concise than the list of tracks for this album button. But it conveys pretty much the same information. And on the opposite side, you have a button that takes you back to where you came from. So we would describe it as the back button. Going through your interface like this, if you find that it's hard to describe parts of your interface like this, that's not because it is extremely difficult to implement accessibility. All we've done so far is just to describe our interface using words. And if you find that this is hard for some elements in your application, that could be a sign that that component maybe isn't perfectly clear. Maybe it's not clearly defined, or perhaps there's some ambiguity to it. Here's another example. It's the built-in weather app in iOS. And when you think about it, it has three main pieces of content. It shows today's weather, but it also shows a list of hourly tracks and a list of hourly forecasts and a list of daily forecasts. And there's some buttons down at the bottom, but we don't look at them for now. There's more than one thing to each of these forecasts, but at a high level, we are representing forecasts and not the individual components. So this means that the elements on screen that we want to talk about, they're not the individual labels or image views. It's the views that group them together, because those are the views that actually do represent a forecast. The interesting thing about this realization that the main views are the one that represent forecasts is that we may have more information about the forecasts than what we have available screen space for. One example could be the inbox in mail. You have these little previews of each email, and they're usually like a line or two. But we don't have the same limitations with screen space and truncation when it comes to these textual descriptions. So usually there will be very, very little reason for us not to include the full subject. But we're still representing a preview of an email, so it wouldn't make sense for us to include the full body of the email, because then we're representing the full email, and there's another screen for that. On the same screen, in the lower right corner, we have another button where it's not obvious at first what it does. But we know it's a button, so we can ask ourselves first, what does it do? And in this case, it shows a list of all the cities that we're showing the weather for. But on the same screen, you can also add more cities. And you can swipe to delete them. And you can also reorder them. So really, you can edit the cities that we're showing the weather for. So we can go back and answer, what is it? Well, it's the Edit Cities button. Again, trying to be as concise as possible. In the context of this app, the Edit Cities button conveys enough information so that the user knows what it does. And enough information so that when we have a conversation within our teams or within developer to designer, we know which button we're talking about. All of these descriptions that we've come up with so far, they happen to be very closely related to the ones which is used by VoiceOver, namely the labels, traits, values, and hints. The label, it's the main piece of information for these elements, and it's usually the answer to what is it, except that we take out what type of control it is, because that information belongs in the trait. Being a button is a trait of that element. It has behavior to it. But it also doesn't matter if it's a UI button or something custom with tap gesture recognizers or anything like that. Because at a conceptual level, we are talking about a button-like element, and that's why it has the button trait. The value is just a textual description of what the current value is for that control. And the hint is used in cases where it's not obvious from just the label what the control does. It usually describes the result of doing some action. So it usually starts with a verb. If you imagine a sentence like tapping this button and then blank, and you fill in the blank. So tapping this button plays music. Tapping this button creates a new playlist. Tapping this button shows the star rating. The last piece is there. Plays music, creates a new playlist, shows the star rating. They could be used as hints for cases where they're needed. But not every element needs a hint, and there's no point in us repeating information because that's just redundant. But it's there for when it is needed. And you will see that if you look at most of Apple's apps, there are very, very few elements that need a hint to describe them. So let's go back and look at these examples again. The playback controls, they really do have the labels previous track, pause, and next track with the button trait. The volume control is simply labeled volume with the value at 50% or whatever the current value is. And to indicate that this is a control where the user can adjust the volume, it is given the adjustable trait. The back and tracklist buttons, they simply have the back and tracklist labels. And the rows for that represents forecast, they really are grouped as a single element. And they have a description that contains all of the information that we use to describe those forecasts. And the Edit Cities button, it's simply labeled Edit Cities. To implement these things in our applications, we simply assign these descriptions to the corresponding properties. And you can do so both in code or in interface builder where it makes sense. The one exception is the value, because it usually relates to some value that's changing. So you can only set that through code. But the rest you can set up either way you want, so you can keep doing it the same way that you like to do the rest of your UI. The next thing that I want to talk about is interaction through gestures. VoiceOver has an interaction model that is based on selecting or focusing on an element and then interacting with it. The user can move the focus by swiping left or right with one finger anywhere on the screen, and it moves to the next or previous element. But they can also do things like continuously dragging along the screen to continuously focus on the element at that location. We've already seen two types of actions, two types of interaction in the form of traits, the button trait and the adjustable trait. The button is something that the user can activate, which triggers the action of that button by double tapping anywhere on the screen. And an adjustable element is something where the user can adjust, increment, or decrement the value by swiping up and down with one finger. Most of the time you will see that the interaction is determined by the trait, but not all traits relate to interaction. There are also traits like being static text or being an image that simply is there to annotate the content. And as we saw before, the traits are very strongly related to the answers to the questions, what is it and what does it do? A third question that we might want to ask ourselves is, what more does it do? Because in some cases, we can do more than one thing with an element. Having more than one action doesn't have to be a bad thing, and it doesn't have to be confusing. But it's always good to make sure that the actions that we have are intentional, but also that we're not forgetting about something. Some people would probably even say that multiple actions for a single element, that's like a power user feature. And you can do that for VoiceOver too. For example, in the inbox in Mail, the user can tap on the mail, but they can also swipe both left and right to reveal even more actions. Now in this case, the swiping is just a detail of how these actions are revealed, and that's not relevant to this example. But these actions are real, and those are what we're looking for. Because that row represents an email, and we can open the email and mark it as read, and flag it and archive it, and do all of those things with it. Using VoiceOver, the user would first focus on that row and then swipe up and down with one finger to choose between the available actions, and then double tap to perform that action. As of iOS 8, we can add these types of actions to any element that we want. The only things that we need is a textual description, and then a target and a selector. You will usually see that the description describes the action as beginning with a verb, but this time it describes the action and not the result, as the hint does. So it would be play instead of plays, or create instead of creates, because it's describing the action. This might also be a good opportunity to ask ourselves if there's any one action that can represent the whole screen. VoiceOver has a few global gestures that you can trigger no matter what the currently focused element is. One of those is a 2-finger double tap, and it's used for just this one thing, a global action. It's called the magic tap, and you can implement it anywhere in your responder chain, even in views that aren't technically on screen. Some examples of it being used is, again, in the music app, where double tapping twice anywhere will pause or resume playback. Another really good example is in the phone application, where you can use it to answer or hang up calls. In most cases, there isn't any one action that can represent a screen like this, but there doesn't have to be, and you shouldn't force one either. But when there is, it can really improve the experience. But not everything in an app is triggered by user interaction. You have things like new messages, or likes, or retweets, or email. When these type of things happens, we might want to inform the user of either any or all of it. So the question to ask ourselves is, what do we want the user to know when this happens? So for example, the user receives an email. What do you want the user to know? Do you simply want them to know that there is a new email? Or maybe you want the user to know that there is a new email from David. Or maybe you want the user to know that there is a new email from David and this was the subject. Or maybe you feel like the user doesn't really need to know about it because emails from David isn't that important. Knowing what we want to convey is the first step. And when we have that, we can start thinking about how we want to do it. The most common way is that we read out some text to the user. But if there's nothing specific to the event that the information that we want to convey, if we only want to tell the user that there is a new email, then a simple sound might convey just the same information. And the sound is nice because it's very short and not particularly disruptive. You will also find that there are some cases or some things that take a user perceivable amount of time. And there are also some things that could fail. Like sending an email. When an email gets sent, what do you want the user to know? It's probably enough in this case that just knowing that it happened, that this email was sent. So in this case, it's fine just playing a little sound. And you will see that Mail does this. It plays the little swoosh sound. And this conveys that the email was sent, but not just for some. It does that for all users. Context is incredibly important when we're describing our applications. And we use it everywhere, trying to be as concise as possible. The music app simply says play, and not play music, because that information is inferred from the context of the music app. The Edit Cities button was simply called Edit Cities, and not Edit Cities we're showing the weather for, because the weather is inferred from the context of the weather app. And the same thing is even more true when it comes to reading out text to the user. Because the user can be in many different states when it happens, so we need to take the different contexts into consideration. If we provide too much information to the user, we provide information that is inferred from the context, that might get annoying, and it can also slow the user down, because we can only read one thing at a time. But at the same time, if we read too little information, then the user may be confused and not really know where this information belongs. One thing that we did in the Skype for iOS application is that we read messages differently, both depending on where the user is, but also where the message is. So in most cases, we read out all of the information. We read out who sent it, in what chat, and what the message was. But if the message was sent in the same chat that the user has on screen, then things start to get interesting. If it's a chat between only the user and one other person, then what we do is that we only read out what that person wrote, trying to recreate the feeling of an actual conversation. You write something, and then you wait a short while, and the phone just reads the response to you. So it's not, David said, how are you? It's just, how are you? If there's multiple people in the same chat, what we do is that we only read out the name when it's different from the last person who said something. So I say something, it reads my name and what I said. I say something again, and it only reads what I said. Someone else will say something, and it will read their name and what they said. We read out the name of the person to change context from David is speaking to someone else is speaking. And within that context, we only need to read out what was actually said. And it is embarrassingly little code involved in this behavior, but I really think that it makes a big difference on the experience, and that it makes chatting like this more enjoyable. But this feature didn't always look like this. It used to be that it only read messages if you were in that chat when the message was received. And then we received some feedback which was telling us that messages wasn't being read. And the problem in this case was that we hadn't really thought about what could happen, when it could happen, but also what did we want the user to know? And as I mentioned before, there is context to build on when that conversation is on screen, but when it isn't, we pretty much have to read out all of the information for it to make sense. So what we did is that we went through the main flow of the application and asked ourselves, what do we want the user to know? And in almost all cases, the user should know that a message was sent by that person in that chat. But there were also some cases where we looked at it and thought, maybe this isn't that important in this context. Like if you were on a call, talking to someone with a real voice, and you received a chat message in another chat. We looked at it and felt like, maybe you can go find that message later on, because we don't want to read something that we don't want to read something and interrupt you when you are listening to another person speaking. We may still go back and revisit the decision and say that maybe we still want you to know that there was a message and maybe play a sound. But different contexts matter. Another area where we get feedback was related to these three headings that scroll in a sort of parallax effect. The problem was that if the text grew longer, the last one didn't appear on screen. This wouldn't really have been a problem because the view scrolled. If it wasn't for the fact that VoiceOver doesn't read elements that is off screen like this. So the last heading was never read out unless the user first selected the second heading. So when people opened the app for the first time, their context wasn't there. At first we looked at it and thought that a hint and a scroll gesture would be the best solution because it was closest to the way that it worked. But then we thought about what it actually represents. It's three choices, one of them is selected. It's almost like a segmented control. So that's what we went with. We mimicked the behavior of the segmented control. And I think that it made it easier to use. Because your job isn't necessarily to perfectly match the view hierarchy. It's more to accurately convey the information. And of course, we would like to do both of them. But when it's not possible, then I chose to go for the latter. Another area where we got feedback was related to the list of contacts. And more precisely to the little dot there that indicates the availability of someone. The dot can have three colors. It can be green when the person is available and online, yellow when the person is away, and it can be red when the person doesn't want to be disturbed. But when the person is offline, there is no dot. And once again, the problem was that we were too focused on the view hierarchy or the details of the implementation, and we didn't really think about the content that it represented. So we simply went back and added the fourth case, offline, no dot. And we added that to the description as well. These things that I'm telling you is things that I've learned from going back and fixing past mistakes like this. And in case it wasn't clear, I wasn't actually saying that you should ask these questions for their own merit and for the answers that they provide. And that doing so sort of gives you accessibility as a nice added bonus. What I actually was saying that accessibility is important. And that a large part of making applications that are easy to use, easy to understand, but also enjoyable to all users comes down to thinking about the application. I would like to conclude by playing a sequence from the Accessibility song by James Dempsey and the Breakpoints.
Some folks ain't got much use for web maps on screens. They get the lay of the land through this alternate means. If you want to build your app for maximum utility, then take a little time, implement accessibility, and tell the story of your application. Describe the glory of its interface so we can know sight unseen what's going on the screen. Share your app with the whole human race.
Thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope that you have lots of interesting questions.
Show your hands. Any questions? Well, okay, there's one right here.
Hi David, nice talk. Not that many people know about accessibility and implement it. I'm wondering, when did you start implementing accessibility in custom controls that you produce, and what was like the driver? Was it joining Skype or something else?
So the question was when I started implementing accessibility from custom controls. It was probably when I started joining Skype, so about 2.5 years ago. And it was a mixture of custom controls, but also just labels for default elements, and quite a lot of things were also, when you do customizations, you sometimes break default behavior. So you go back and you find that something which works in like plain vanilla table view doesn't work in your table view, and then you go back and try to figure out what. But and the second part of your question was the reason why, or the motivator. And I don't really know when it started. I know when it went from just a small interest to being like a big thing to me. And that was actually at local Cocoa Heads, where the organizer at that time had invited a blind user to come and talk to everyone about being a blind user using their phone. And he traveled to Stockholm on his own using his phone, and the first thing he explained to us was his travel, of how he booked the train ticket and did all of those things, and it was a very emotional experience. And that's when it went from just being a thing to being a big thing for me.
Thank you. Can I ask one more? Yeah. So does implementing accessibility provides you with like any additional gains, like easier UI automation testing, stuff like that? Do you use that?
Yeah, we have a lot of UI automation, and it's not only because of the accessibility. If you implement UI automation the way that the guidelines say, you shouldn't really be touching the accessibility labels and stuff. There are identifiers that are uniquely for automation. You can, of course, check the labels and stuff. But yes, it's certainly very hard to do automation if you don't have any accessibility implemented.
Thanks.
Hi, David. I've seen your amazing work in the SyncKit book, and I was wondering whether you have tried to mix accessibility with any of your 3D work or hobbies or projects.
Yes. So it's a bit tricky, but it's certainly not impossible, and you have decent tools to help you. The main problem is, of course, describing things, but then also mapping that to screen coordinates. And in 3D, SyncIt helps you do that by both figuring out the bounding box, but then also projecting that to the screen and translating it into screen coordinates. So with a little bit of work and iterating like recursively through every element, possibly for every frame, you can figure out the frames of stuff that is visible. And occlusion is tricky, but it is certainly doable.
Any last question? The other? Okay.
I had a very good question before, but and I was hoping that someone would ask it again. And it was related to how do you convince a client or how do you convince a manager that it's worthwhile investing in accessibility? Because it felt like it was taking, it usually came up at the end of the project and it was so hard getting extra time for it when everything else was supposed to happen. That was roughly the summary of the question. And if you want to do accessibility the best way, it's really to do it as early on as possible, and also to communicate with your designer. At least that's been my experience. So when I get a feature that I'm supposed to implement, the first thing I do is that for myself, I try and just describe everything so that I know what they are. And if I have questions or if I think that it could be more than one thing, I go to the designer and ask them so that my understanding of what I'm building matches their understanding. And if they have a hard time describing it to me, then I start asking them more questions. And that way, you get all of the hard work early on, but you also get these additional benefits. So the scenario that I was painting is actually, there's actually some merits to it. If you ask these questions very early on, you can figure out that maybe there's something, you can't quite put your finger on it, but there's something wrong with this one, and then you start talking about it. And that talking basically does the hard part of figuring out how to describe it. And when you have the descriptions, then the rest is mainly going in and then just assigning it everywhere. Yeah. Sorry, the question was how many percentage of usage?
What's the percentage of users is using accessibility?
Oh, that's hard. I don't have any hard numbers, but I think it's a fairly high percentage. I don't really think you should care too much about the percentage, though. I don't think that's a good way of working at it. Maybe it is, but I will say that if you have interaction with them,
Maybe percentage was
yeah,
not good. What's the amount? More or less?
I don't know either. But I will tell you that they are probably the most passionate and the best users that you will ever have. The feedback they give and the investment that they have in your app, and especially if you communicate back to them, it is like they're the best users that you will ever encounter.
How do you test the accessibility in your app?
So testing accessibility has some difficulties. We use KIF for most of our testing, and KIF uses accessibility, but not in the way that I would like to do it. So it is testing the application through accessibility, but it's not testing accessibility. So you can make sure that you have the right label set up and that you don't mislabel stuff. I also write an abstraction, or we have an abstraction on top of many of the accessibility methods that you use to read out text. so that we can mock that when we run unit tests. So we can actually mock and record all the messages that get sent. So you can fake post messages in a chat, and you can verify that they were read out in the right order and didn't cut each other off and things like that.
Do you have any experience in working with accessibility and localization as well? Because it seems that you can treat the accessibility labels, the descriptions of the user interface controls, as the comments for the translators for providing the correct localization. You can just provide that accessibility labels to them, and you will get much better transcriptions.
Oh, that's a hard question. Accessibility and localization and internationalization are very strongly related, but I don't always think that the description that you give to a translator would make a good label or hint. If you go to the accessibility programming guide that Apple has, they have very concrete tips about how you should structure the different types of information, and things like hints should always begin with a verb, the verb should be in this form, be as concise as possible. They give a bunch of examples, and I think that you're using them for two different things. You want to be almost as informative and broad as possible when you describe something to your translator, and especially you are providing a lot of context, because when you're translating some languages, the words may translate differently depending on the context. So you're providing a lot of the context in that comment. That context is mostly inferred for the information, so you would likely get quite long labels, which, as I said, it can slow the user down because they need to wait for one or wait to get to the relevant information before they move to the next element. My best approach is simply to, whenever you have buttons or elements with text, that text probably tries to be as short and concise as possible already, because there's limited amount of screen space. So that one would work really well as a label, because again, it's very concise and you already think that it describes the component well enough. But if you have things that are icons, I would go for separate labels. And if translation is a burden for you, try and be as good as possible in the burden and provide a good comment to the translator, and in that case you may do fine without a hint. So you have your requirements.